Hello everybody, and welcome to the lecture on biological molecules. So, molecule, just to go ahead and give you that word, a molecule is a group of atoms that are joined together by covalent bonds. Right? So atoms joined by covalent bonds form a molecule, or form molecules. Okay. So, for example, we talked about water, probably more than you want. Water is a molecule, right? Oxygen, hydrogen atoms joined together by a covalent bond. Okay. I've got those four elements listed on the board because if it hasn't ingrained itself into your brain yet, make sure that it does very soon. These four elements are of utmost importance when looking at life. Living organisms are built from these four. And carbon is especially singled out because most molecules that build life have carbon as kind of the skeletal framework of the molecule, with hydrogens and oxygens and nitrogens built around it. For example, this is glucose. This is a simple sugar, and you'll notice it has a ring of carbons with an oxygen as well, and it has oxygen and hydrogen atoms bonded to that framework, which is primarily carbon. So it is generally stated that carbon is the foundation of most molecules that make up living organisms. And if you remember from before, carbon has 6 electrons, which means that in order to be stable, it needs 4 more. And so carbon is going to share electrons in such a way that it always gets 4 more. And these lines represent a bond, a covalent bond, a shared pair of electrons. And so carbon is sharing with 4 other atoms, and thus it gets its stability. And if you look at all of the carbons here, they've all got 4 bonds to become stable. So carbon, generally thought of as the foundation of molecules that make up living things. If a molecule has carbon and hydrogen, it is said to be biologically organic. So you hear organic, you think of going to the grocery store, you find that section of food that has no pesticides, locally grown, way more expensive. That is what you think of when you think of organic, I'm sure. And the U.S. Department of Agriculture has its own definition of what constitutes organic food. But in terms of this class and biologically speaking, anything that has carbon and hydrogen is organic, which means all living things are considered organic, which also means all food is organic. So if you go to McDonald's and and I don't eat at McDonald's much, so I honestly don't even know what type of burger that is. Maybe double quarter pounder with cheese or something. Whatever it is, that plus the fries plus the soda, all of those are organic. That is a nice organic meal in terms of the biological definition of the word. So organic means carbon and hydrogen are present, and all living things are organic because all living things have both of those elements. There are many different molecules in the world, but if you look at life, we can classify almost all molecules that make up life into one of 4 groups. And you can see them up there, but I'm going to write them anyway too. Carbohydrates, proteins, lipids, that's fats and oils and stuff like that. And then probably the least familiar of these to you, nucleic acids. These 4 things are called macromolecules. And if you look at the molecules that build life, you can classify virtually all of them into one of these four groups. Macro means big or large. So macromolecules must be molecules that are big, at least on a molecular scale. And they are. Right? So there's another salmon picture. I used a salmon picture a couple lectures ago as well. I must really be hungry for salmon when I made these PowerPoints. All right. So 3 of these have a unique structure in terms of how they're set up, and that would be carbohydrates, at least some of them, all proteins, and all nucleic acids. Lipids are kind of the odd one out in terms of how they're built. But all proteins, all nucleic acids, and some carbohydrates follow what's called the polymer model. And here's how that works. The word poly is a Greek word that means many or a lot. So a polymer must have a lot of something, and it does. The word mono, it's either Greek or Latin, I think Greek. It means one. Right? So, take a look at this chain here. This long chain is a hypothetical protein. We just established that proteins are one of the types of macromolecules. And in real life, this would be a lot longer, but this example illustrates it well. This is a long chain. This is large. This is a macromolecule. This is a protein. Each of these little colorful circles represents one amino acid. Amino acids are the building blocks of proteins. So, if you look, one of them, not very large, 2 of them, getting longer, do that 100 plus times, you've got a massive chain. The building blocks are called amino acids. As you can see by the color variation, there's quite a few of them. There are 20 different varieties. And all strung together, they make this long chain called a protein. The amino acid is the building block. It's called a monomer. Remember, mono means one, and so one of these is a monomer. String a bunch of them together, and now you've got what's called a polymer. Poly means many. Many monomers together make a big, long polymer chain. That's how proteins are built. That's how nucleic acids are built. That's how some carbohydrates are built. Let's talk about carbohydrates. So, carbohydrate is built from carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, and it occurs in a ratio of 1 to 2 to 1. So there's usually 1 carbon, 2 hydrogen, 1 oxygen. That ratio is relatively speaking what a carbohydrate is going to have. So, carbohydrates. Well, let me see what the next slide is. Okay. Carbohydrates are your body's primary energy source. I don't know if any of you have run a marathon, but if you have, one thing that a lot of marathon runners like to eat before they run is pasta. Pasta contains a large amount of carbohydrates, good energy for you to have as fuel when you're running those 26 plus miles of a marathon. Your body can also use protein and lipids as an energy source, but carbs are the body's primary source. Okay. There are 3 subtypes of carbohydrates that we're going to look at, and these words may be long, but when you break them down, it actually is pretty easy to understand. The suffix saccharide means sugar. So look at the 3 different types we have. Monosaccharides, disaccharides, polysaccharides. You already know that mono means one, poly means many, and di means 2. So we've got 1 sugar, that's your simple sugars, 2 sugars, or 2 sugar, that's going to be 2 of these together, and then many sugars, that's going to be your big long polymer chains like starch. And so these are 3 subcategories of carbohydrates that we're going to look at. The pictures here just illustrate some examples of carbohydrates in your everyday life diet. Potatoes, of course, contain starch, which is going to be one of the long chains. Ketchup contains high fructose corn syrup, which is a mixture of 2 of these simple sugars. So let's go ahead and start with those simple sugars. Monosaccharides. Mono means 1. This is going to be 1 molecule, right? Like you see here. This is glucose. This is fructose. They're both simple sugars. Technically speaking, monosaccharides can have anywhere between 3 to 6 carbon atoms in them, but most of them have 6, and the 2 that I'm concerned about you knowing both have 6. Let's take a look at them here. You may have heard of one or both of these. Top left, we've got glucose. So this is a simple sugar. Notice the arrangement of the atoms in there. If you look at the actual count of atoms, the chemical formula for glucose, C6H12O6. 1 to 2 to 1 ratio, perfect carbohydrate. Top right here we have fructose. Fruit sugar, which structurally you can see it's different. This is a pentagon, this is a hexagon. They're both simple sugars, but they're structurally different. If you actually count the number of atoms in fructose, it's the same as glucose. The chemical formula is the same. The structure is different though. Same chemical formula, different structure. The term for that is isomers. Glucose and fructose are isomers. Same atoms, same number of each element in them, but structurally they are different. Both glucose and fructose are prevalent in your diet, no doubt. Glucose is found in pastas, bread, rice, those kind of things, wheat-based foods. Fructose is the dominant sugar found in fruits and vegetables. I have some onions here just to illustrate that onions store excess sugar that they make in the bulbs as glucose, right? So this is one vegetable that has glucose, not fructose, but as a general rule, fructose tends to be found in fruits and vegetables and glucose in the more wheat-based products. But both of those are simple sugars, monosaccharides. Now what I want you to do is look at these 2 up here and imagine that we joined them together. Now we will have two simple sugars together, and this is what's called a disaccharide. So di means two. Disaccharides occur when something called a dehydration reaction joins them together. So an example of a disaccharide would be table sugar. So if you go to a Walmart or Kroger or something, and you buy the big bag of sugar, you're buying sucrose. And this is actually glucose and fructose together as a pair. It is a disaccharide. Another example of a disaccharide is lactose. So, lactose contains the two simple sugars, glucose and galactose, and together they make milk sugar, known as lactose. If you are lactose intolerant, you don't produce the enzyme as an adult to break apart the bond between the two simple sugars in lactose. So lactose and sucrose are both they're both disaccharides. I want you to keep this dehydration reaction concept in mind. So you're a plant. You use the sun to convert carbon dioxide into sugar, and you make glucose, which is a sugar with a hexagonal shape. There we go. You make glucose. You make several glucose molecules. And so on and so forth down the line. Certain plant species, for example potatoes, choose to store their glucose as a chain. So glucose can be stored individually like this, which is how the onion bulbs do it, or you can join them all together and make a nice long chain. If you make a chain like that, you are what's called a polysaccharide. So think back to first couple slides when we talked about polymer and monomer. If you make a big long chain of repeating simple sugars, you are now a polymer, because there's a lot of them. And each simple sugar in that chain is called a monomer. One such chain of simple sugars is starch. So plants use starch to store energy. I like to use potatoes as the example because everybody's familiar with them. But starch is just this really long chain of one glucose molecule after the other. And so starch is an example of what's called a polymer, right? And glucose in starch would be the building block or the monomer that's involved. So polymer, just in case you're wondering about this, polymer doesn't just refer to sugars. Proteins can also be a polymer, for example. Polysaccharide specifically refers to a polymer of sugar, a really long chain of sugars. Starch is one such example. Another example of a polysaccharide is glycogen, which you have. Starch is for plants, glycogen is found in animals, including humans. Glycogen is a source of short-term energy storage. So your liver and muscle cells will store glycogen, and you can access that for energy if you're doing some type of activity that requires it. Long-term, your body uses adipose or fat tissue, but for short-term access, you also use glycogen, which is a long chain of glucoses, similar to starch, but structurally different from it. So we've got monosaccharides. Let's go back here real quick. We've got monosaccharides, simple sugars, one molecule, glucose and fructose, the most common examples. Disaccharides, which exist as a pair of monosaccharides together. Table sugar, sucrose, and lactose are two examples. And then polysaccharides, that would be long repeating chains of simple sugars making a nice long polymer. Starch and glycogen are two examples of polysaccharides. There are two more to be aware of. One of them is called cellulose. So cellulose is found only in plants, and it's found in their cell walls. So cellulose is a long sugar chain. It's a chain of sugars forming a polysaccharide that is really tough to break apart. So cellulose, long string of glucose molecules, forms plant cell walls, makes plants hard to digest. If you went out and started eating grass like this cow, which I hope you do not do, but if you did, you couldn't digest it well at all. You could barely digest it at all. Cows have multiple chambered stomachs and bacteria in their gut that break down the cellulose for them, allowing them to tap into the nutrients available within that grass. So many plants are not, I don't want to say not edible to us, but you can't get anything out of them because your body can't break apart the cellulose. It's just too hard. The other polysaccharide, the last one, is called chitin. Chitin is found in insects. And it's found in the cell walls of mushrooms. So chitin, another long chain of glucose molecules making this big polymer. Chitin makes up the exoskeleton of insects. So insects, as they grow, they have to break out of their skeleton because it surrounds their body. It's an exoskeleton. And the skeleton itself, you've probably seen them clinging to buildings or trees. That skeleton is made up of sugars. It's made up of glucose. And so that's a good, strong structural component for our insects. And it's made of sugars. Interesting. It's also in mushroom cell walls. All right, we're going to do lipids next. Lipids Actually, you know what? We're going to skip lipids and go to proteins. As long as your brain right now is in the polymer, monomer mindset, I want to get this one knocked out. So proteins are a long polymer chain. The building blocks of proteins, and I mentioned this earlier in the lecture, are amino acids. So a whole bunch of amino acids strung together will make a protein. What do proteins do? We talked about carbohydrates. Our primary function in our body for carbs is our energy source. In contrast to that, physically, you're built primarily from proteins. So your body physically is built primarily from proteins. Some examples of protein function, and there could be a whole class on protein function, they do so much stuff. But some examples. Enzymes to help with chemical reactions. You eat some starch, you eat a sandwich. You have an enzyme in your body called amylase that speeds up the breakdown of starch so that you can digest it as it goes through your system and get the nutrients out of that sandwich. If you didn't have that particular enzyme, you couldn't break it down quickly enough, you wouldn't get anything out of it. That's true for everything you eat. You have digestive enzymes for all of your foods. So enzymes help speed up reactions within your body. Your structure, your physical structure, is principally proteins, and one of the most prevalent that you see in nature is keratin. Some examples of things that are made of keratin would be bird feathers, bird beaks, claws, or in the bird's case, I don't want to say talons for a little blue jay, but it's, let's say it's claws. Other animal claws, like mammals, like lions and such, your fingernails, your hair, and the fur of other mammals, scales, horns, like a rhino's horn. It's just a very widespread protein that makes up the structural component of a whole lot of stuff. Also, certain hormones, like the hormone insulin, which helps regulate your blood sugar, that's also going to be a protein. And so there's more to it than this. Proteins assist in muscular movement. They do a whole lot of stuff. One important thing to note with proteins is that the shape is necessary for them to properly function. So if you guys are like me, you like eggs, but you cook eggs before you eat them. By the way, if you're wondering about this pizza picture, it has to do with talking about lactase, which we've already talked about. I'll tell you what, let's just reiterate it. So lactase, it's an enzyme, it's a protein that lets you digest milk sugar. So if you don't make it, as an adult, you're lactose intolerant. And so that's another example of a protein. That's a giant piece of pizza. Looks really good right now. So if a protein loses its shape, it becomes what's called denatured, and it can no longer function. And the example I usually use is a paper clip. So paper clip, right? That it needs to have that shape to do its job. You can bend it, and physically speaking, it's still the same metal structure, but now it can't do its job anymore. It doesn't have the right shape. So proteins need their shape to function. If you expose a protein to a lot of heat, or a lot of salt, or other extreme changes in its environment, it might lose its shape. That's what happens when you heat up an egg. The albumin protein that makes up the viscous, clear part of the egg turns white and clumps together when you expose it to heat. And so that's what you're doing when you're cooking an egg. You're also killing salmonella bacteria potentially, so it's good to cook your eggs. But that's why the egg changes its color and shape and texture there. So proteins, wide variety of functions going on with them. We talked about the fact that they are a long chain of amino acids. There are 20 different amino acids in the world, and you can see all 20 of them right here. Now I want you to think about the English language. There's 26 letters, and you can arrange those letters in so many different ways, virtually an infinite number of ways you can arrange them, especially if your words are thousands of letters long. These 20 amino acids can be arranged so many different ways, and thus we can end up making many, many different types of proteins, because each protein is unique from another protein by the way that these things are arranged within it. So proteins, a long repeating chain of amino acids. What makes each one different from the other is that they have different amino acids in different arrangements, kind of like different words have different letters. Back to lipids here. Give me a moment. So lipids are not built by the monomer-polymer setup. Instead, all lipids share a feature in common, which is they do not like water. They're hydrophobic. If you've ever wondered why ducks don't get waterlogged, it has to do with a lipid that they use. So, if you're a duck, you gotta stay light to fly, right? Birds in general are just built for flight. They have honeycomb bones, which are very light. Feathers are light. They've got reduced, minimized skeletal structure. It's all about being light so you can fly. Well, water is heavy, and feathers themselves are not waterproof. So what birds do is they have a gland back here called the uropygial gland. They get oil from it. Oil is a lipid, which means it does not mix with water. They put it all over their feathers, which makes the feathers then hydrophobic because they're now covered in this oil. And so when they're swimming in water, water might touch the feather, but it's going to hit that layer of oil and just bounce right off. So it's a good way for them to maintain their light weight and be able to fly efficiently in spite of living in the water. Lipids do a whole number of different things. Some examples would be energy storage. So when we eat food, we use some of that for immediate energy needs, but if we eat more than we need, our body is going to store some of that in the form of adipose tissue. It's the most compact way of storing energy. That's why our body uses adipose tissue or fat tissue as the method of energy storage, but it's a lipid and it's used for long-term energy storage. Also, insulation. If you look at Arctic creatures like our polar bear here, they have a layer of fat tissue that's 4 inches thick, which helps keep them warm in an environment that you and I would die very quickly in from hypothermia. Hormones, certain hormones are lipids, and also this thing here, cell membranes, which we'll talk about shortly. let's go ahead and start with talking about fats. So fats are a type of lipid. All fats are lipids, but not all lipids are fats. The general construction of a fat molecule is that you've got the head, which is made of glycerol, and then you've got three tails called fatty acid tails. Another name for fats is triglycerides, tri coming from the three fatty acid tails. Two major types of fats that you'll encounter are saturated and unsaturated. So let's go ahead and start with saturated fats. Take a look at this picture over here. Notice how the fatty acid chains are completely straight. There's no bend to them. They just are completely straight. That's because fatty acid chain, which is carbon and hydrogen entirely, has no double bonds between any of the carbons. The double bond causes the little jutting out of the fatty acid chain. In a saturated fat, there is no double bond, which means the chain stays straight with all three chains. Unfortunately, that is part of what contributes to their ability to clump together well and contribute to atherosclerosis, which is plaque in your arteries. But saturated fats, there's no double bond in there. Foods that would have a high amount of saturated fat would include things like beef and steak, bacon, butter, lard, cheeses, in fact, anything dairy. All of these are animal products. Plant products in general do not have saturated fats. In excess, and the key there is in excess, saturated fat can contribute to heart disease because it tends to clump together thanks to its structure. All of those foods are fine if you have them in very moderate amounts, but in excess, then it's not a good thing. Unsaturated fats, in contrast, they don't have the three straight chains. One of the chains, at least, is going to have a double bond here, and that's going to cause it to jut out at the end. Makes them less susceptible to clumping and generally a lot better for you. So unsaturated fats have a double bond and a little jutting out there like you see. They come from plant products, so foods that would have unsaturated fat, that up here. Foods that have unsaturated fat would include vegetable oils, nuts, avocados. Those are the most common examples. Plant products, many of them are liquid at room temperature. I know nuts and avocados obviously are not, but the oils with them that have this unsaturated fat, or the oils that are the unsaturated fat, they're liquid at room temperature. These are healthy. These are the quote-unquote good fats that you want. Yeah, all fats can be healthy in moderation. Just saturated fat, you want to avoid a large amount of that. All right. So those are the fats. There's also trans fat, which is really, really bad for you. We're not going to talk about that one though. Let's talk about phospholipids. So these are lipids that are not fats. Phospholipids build the outer membrane of cells. So if you look at a cell here, you got the nucleus and whatever else you'll have in here. That barrier that signifies the outer edge of the cell, that is your cell membrane, aka the outer membrane. That is built from these. So a phospholipid has two parts. It's got the phosphate, which is the head part, and then it's got the tail, which really doesn't like water. Really doesn't like water. The head, though, the phosphate head, really does like water. So you've got contrasting responses to water depending on which side of this phospholipid you're looking at. So if you look at a cell and the cell's environment, inside the cell, this is called the cytoplasm. This is mostly water. And if you look outside the cell, this is the extracellular environment. This is also mostly water. So in order to not expose this poor hydrophobic tail to either direction, phospholipids make a double membrane so that the hydrophilic head is facing both out of the cell and into the cell. These pink hydrophilic heads are happy. They are touching water here and here. Hydrophobic tails get to face inward, protected from the water, and that is how the outer membrane of every cell in your body is constructed. So phospholipids are pretty important in terms of living organisms because they build the fundamental unit of life, the cell. The last lipid that I'm going to mention here is the steroid. So when you think of steroids, you think of the anabolic steroids that certain athletes pump themselves up with to increase strength. And those are a modified hormone that assists in muscular growth, and they are based upon a naturally occurring steroid, but steroids in general are not a bad thing. They are lipids built from 4 fused carbon rings. You can see them here. And your body produces them naturally all the time. In fact, cholesterol is a steroid. It's the steroid that your body produces and then builds all other steroids from. Testosterone is a steroid. Estradiol, which is a type of estrogen, that's a steroid. There are many other types as well, but they're naturally occurring. They have important roles to play within your body. Steroid's kind of a dirty word, and again, the anabolic stuff is very bad, but there are naturally occurring steroids as well. Let's see, onward to the last macromolecule, and the one that you probably aren't familiar with, nucleic acids. You've got a cell. Let's put a cell right here. And within virtually all of your cells, you have a nucleus, and within that nucleus, you have all of your DNA, or almost all of your DNA. DNA stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. So DNA is a type of nucleic acid. There's another kind called RNA, which we'll get to later. The DNA is the most familiar one. Nucleic acids follow that monomer-polymer model again. So the nucleic acid itself is the polymer, big long chain. The building block of a nucleic acid is called a nucleotide. Forgot the E. A nucleotide, which is a monomer. I'd like to focus on this sentence right here. DNA is the blueprint for building a living thing. So, let's talk about how that works. Here is a hypothetical cell. DNA exists within the nucleus of the cell. It exists in these long strands called chromosomes. That is not important right now. But ultimately, your DNA gets read by these protein building organelles out here called ribosomes. DNA, or I should say a little section of DNA, is transcribed into another type of nucleic acid called RNA, which then goes out to find these ribosomes. They read the letters of your DNA / the RNA copy of it, and then they build the appropriate protein in response to what your DNA's letters say. Think of RNA like a photocopy. DNA is the original blueprint. RNA is the photocopy that gets brought to the construction site. So I've been talking about DNA as if it's a language, as if it's letters. The 4 letters of DNA correspond to 4 molecules that actually occur within the DNA. Those molecules are adenine, cytosine, thymine, and guanine. ACTG. DNA is a polymer, like we've mentioned, and the monomers are called nucleotides. A nucleotide contains one of these 4 letters, just one. I know it's tough to see, but if you look, this is showing a little clip from a long double-stranded DNA molecule here. This is one nucleotide, and it has a C, cytosine molecule. The next one up here has an A, adenine, T, thymine. Each nucleotide has one of those letters. So, you've got DNA, long strands of it, with a certain letter arrangement. You could have something like this in a particular section of DNA. And it goes on much longer than this, but you get the idea. DNA is double-stranded, so you'll notice that there is a nucleotide on each side of the strand, and so it's really a pair of nucleotides. And if you look, A and T, C and G always go together. So how does this work then, this whole DNA builds you? How does that work? Well, you've got a specific arrangement of these letters. Your DNA has nucleotides, that's the monomers, building blocks. Your DNA has nucleotides in a particular arrangement. That arrangement is the blueprint for you. The ribosomes, the builders of proteins, which ultimately are what you're built of, they read the letter arrangement and then build accordingly. You might have this combination of letters. Somebody next to you might have that combination of letters. This instructs the ribosomes to build one thing. This could instruct them to build something else. That is how your DNA determines what you look like. The arrangement of letters, the arrangement of nucleotides is different from one person to the next. They're not that different. You're 99% similar to everyone else on the planet. You're 98% similar to a chimpanzee. You're nearly 50% similar to a banana. We share a lot of DNA in terms of the arrangement of letters with other species. But there's enough difference in there, even just amongst humans, that you have a lot of variety. But that is a general summary of how DNA determines what you look like and who you physically are. So, we talked about a nucleotide. If you actually look at the structure of a nucleotide, the letters themselves, the A's and C's and T's and G's, they're just part of it. There's a backbone to both sides of DNA made of sugar and phosphate in a repeating pattern. So the letters here, that's what's different between you and other people and other organisms. Let's go ahead and see what the next slide has for us. Here we go. This is summarizing what I told you. There are 4 different letters. The technical term for these, by the way, is nitrogenous bases. So here, to avoid confusion, let me go back. This is a nucleotide. This is a building block of DNA. This little letter, which is the important part because that's what's different between individuals, that letter is specifically called a nitrogenous base. Nucleotide, nitrogenous base. The whole shebang, the whole chain, that's called a nucleic acid. So the 4 bases, we got A, C, T, G. The arrangement of those letters, those bases, in DNA is different in every species and in every organism. And so everybody has a slightly different blueprint. And these pictures just kind of illustrate that concept that we talked about. So I think the nucleic acids are one of the trickier ones to comprehend. So if you are following along with this, that is excellent. Feel free to watch again. I'm going to link a YouTube video that goes over it as well in case this didn't clear it up for you or help you understand as well as it should. And I believe that should be the last slide. Yep. So those are the 4 macromolecules that build living organisms.